Three mafia bosses pointed their guns at one another, each claiming ownership of the same terrified flower seller. Nobody argued over money. Nobody argued over territory. They argued over her. Moments earlier, all three had discovered they held legally signed contracts, proving the same young woman had been pledged to them as payment for $1 million gambling debt. As dozens of armed soldiers prepared for a massacre, the trembling rose seller said something that stunned every man in the room. "If you're going to fight over me, at least let me earn the debt first." That single sentence stopped a mafia war before the first trigger was pulled. Only 24 hours earlier, Maeve Donovan had believed her greatest challenge was selling enough roses to pay the rent. Every evening, she stood beneath the old street lamps near Boston's waterfront, carrying a worn basket filled with fresh flowers she purchased before sunrise. Most people never remembered her face. They remembered only the soft voice asking if someone special deserved a rose. Some nights, she sold every flower. Other nights, she walked home with nearly a full basket and empty pockets. Still, she never complained. Every dollar she earned disappeared almost immediately. Rent, groceries, medicine, and most of all, the endless debts left behind by her father, Patrick Donovan. Patrick always promised that the next bet would fix everything. The next card. The next race. The next lucky night. For nearly 20 years, those promises became the soundtrack of Maeve's life. She quit college halfway through her mathematics degree because someone had to keep the electricity running. While classmates prepared for careers, she memorized grocery discounts, negotiated overdue bills, and learned how to stretch $20 across an entire week. She never considered herself unlucky, only responsible. Unlike her father, Patrick possessed an extraordinary talent. He could turn every act of kindness into another opportunity to borrow money. Friends disappeared. Neighbors stopped answering the door. Banks rejected him years ago. Eventually, the only people still willing to lend him money were men whose contracts were enforced with bullets instead of lawyers. Maeve never knew how deep those debts truly reached. Patrick made certain of that. Whenever she asked questions, he smiled with tired eyes and insisted everything was under control. She wanted to believe him, because believing him was easier than accepting the alternative. Then, one rainy Tuesday morning, she returned home carrying unsold roses and found the apartment door hanging open. Furniture had been overturned, cabinets emptied, drawers scattered across the floor. At first, she thought burglars had broken in. Then she noticed something stranger. Nothing valuable was missing. Instead, every photograph containing Patrick had disappeared. Every piece of clothing he owned was gone. The closet stood completely empty. On the kitchen table rested a single envelope, bearing only her name. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay 3 identical contracts. Each carried Patrick Donovan's signature. Each promised the same collateral. Maeve Donovan. Her. She read the documents once, then twice, then a third time, unable to accept what the words actually meant. Patrick had borrowed money from 3 completely different mafia organizations. Nearly $1 million in total. Instead of property, instead of businesses, instead of assets, he had pledged his daughter 3 separate times. The front door slammed behind her. She turned slowly. 6 armed men stood inside the apartment. Their suits were immaculate. Their expressions were not. "The debt collector?" one asked quietly. Another shook his head. "No. Recovery team." Before anyone moved, another voice echoed from the hallway. "Step away from the girl." More footsteps. More weapons. Within seconds, the tiny apartment filled with armed soldiers wearing different insignias. Nobody recognized the others as allies, because they weren't. One carried the silver wolf emblem of the Volkov Syndicate. Another wore the black crest of the Merino organization. The third group displayed the crimson raven belonging to the Callahan family. Every man had arrived for the same reason: to collect payment. Unfortunately, payment had already been promised elsewhere. Silence settled over the apartment. Then everyone reached for their weapons. Maeve stood frozen between three criminal empires that had spent years competing for territory across the East Coast. She expected shouting. Instead, she saw calculation. Minutes later, 3 black vehicles arrived outside the apartment. Each carried one of the men whose names dominated whispers throughout the underworld. Adrian Volkov entered first. Tall, perfectly composed. His calm expression somehow felt more dangerous than open anger. He studied the contracts without speaking, then looked directly at Maeve. Not with cruelty, with evaluation, as though estimating the future value of an unfamiliar investment. Luca Marino arrived next, elegant enough to pass for the CEO of an international corporation. He barely acknowledged anyone before examining every signature, every date, every financial clause. His eyes narrowed. The numbers match. Finally came Knox Callahan, towering, scarred. His heavy footsteps seemed capable of shaking the old apartment floor. Unlike the others, Knox did not bother reading immediately. He simply looked at Patrick's empty chair, then at Maeve. "So, your father ran." She lowered her eyes. Yes. Knox cursed under his breath. Not because of the debt, because even he seemed disgusted by a father abandoning his own daughter. Adrian finally broke the silence. "If each contract is genuine," Luca finished the sentence, "then killing each other over collateral benefits no one." Knox folded his arms. "So what do you suggest?" Adrian looked toward Maeve. "We keep the asset alive." Luca nodded almost instantly. "Joint supervision. The debt remains. The investment remains. The war waits." Knox disliked compromise. Everyone knew that, yet after several long seconds, he agreed. Not out of kindness, out of mathematics. A Mafia war would cost hundreds of lives, millions of dollars. Years of rebuilding. One frightened flower seller simply wasn't worth that price. Or so they believed. Standing in the middle of the room, clutching the contracts that had destroyed her old life, Maeve realized something extraordinary. For the first time, nobody intended to kill her. Nobody intended to free her either. To the 3 most powerful Mafia bosses in Boston, she wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't a person. She was merely an asset, whose true value had not yet been calculated. And none of them had the slightest idea. They had just acquired the most valuable investment any of them would ever make. The first week under joint supervision felt less like imprisonment and more like living inside a carefully designed experiment. Each Mafia boss insisted on different security protocols. Adrian assigned disciplined guards who rarely spoke. Luca installed cameras in every hallway and required written reports for everything she did. Knox simply stationed enormous men outside every door with one instruction: if she disappears, so do you. No one asked Maeve what she wanted. No one expected her opinion to matter. To everyone inside the headquarters, she remained exactly what the contracts described: collateral, a debt with a heartbeat. The 3 syndicates rotated responsibility every few days, preventing either side from gaining an advantage over the others. During Adrian's rotation, silence ruled the building. Every meeting started on time. Every shipment departed according to schedule. Every employee moved with military precision. Adrian rarely issued orders twice. People obeyed because disappointing him felt worse than being punished. Maeve spent hours sitting quietly near conference rooms while lawyers debated contracts she barely understood. Nobody bothered sending her away. Nobody imagined she was listening. She noticed something strange. Experienced executives often argued over decisions using instinct. Adrian never did. He waited, collected information, compared possibilities. Only then did he speak. The room always became quiet. Not because he was loud, because he was usually right. She admired that. Not the power, the discipline. Luca's headquarters could not have been more different. Instead of maps and weapons, every office contained computer screens displaying shipping routes, fuel costs, customs reports, and financial forecasts. Numbers covered nearly every wall. Employees spoke in percentages instead of emotions. One afternoon, while waiting outside Luca's office, Maeve noticed a stack of accounting reports abandoned on a nearby desk. She wasn't trying to spy. She simply recognized familiar patterns. Years earlier, before leaving university, statistics had been her favorite subject. Numbers comforted her. Unlike people, numbers rarely lied. She glanced casually across several pages. Revenue, warehouse expenses, insurance, fuel, inventory losses. Perfectly ordinary, until they weren't. Her eyes stopped. Page 23. Warehouse 8. A transportation fee had increased by exactly 4%. Nothing unusual. Except another warehouse showed the same increase. Then another. Different companies. Different months. Different shipping routes. Yet always, exactly 4%. She frowned. Too precise. Too consistent. She turned another page. Again. 4%. Then 3.9. Then 4.1. Small enough to avoid suspicion. Large enough to generate enormous profits over hundreds of shipments. Someone had hidden theft inside statistical noise. You've been staring at those reports for 10 minutes. The voice startled her. Luca stood in the doorway. Expression unreadable. She immediately stepped away. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to invade your privacy. He looked at the reports, then back at her. What exactly caught your attention? She hesitated. Why would a mafia boss believe a flower seller? Still, he had asked. The losses. They aren't random. One eyebrow lifted. They're designed. Luca crossed his arms. Explain. She pointed carefully. If trucks genuinely suffered independent losses, the percentages would fluctuate naturally. Some would be higher, some lower. But these numbers stay inside an almost perfect statistical corridor. She traced several rows with her finger. Whoever created these reports understands probability. They're stealing just enough to appear normal. Luca remained silent. Finally, he answered. My accountants reviewed these files. They found nothing. I know, she replied softly. That's why whoever did this is dangerous. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Luca closed the folder. Interesting theory. Nothing more. No praise, no criticism. He simply walked away. Maeve sighed quietly. She should have expected that. Why would one of the wealthiest criminal financiers in America trust observations from someone who sold roses on sidewalks? Later that evening, she replayed the numbers in her mind. Something still bothered her. Not just the percentages. The dates. Every suspicious shipment occurred shortly before inventory audits, meaning stolen goods disappeared before anyone performed physical counts. It wasn't one warehouse. It wasn't one accountant. Someone coordinated the entire system across multiple organizations. That required influence, resources, planning. The following morning, she found another opportunity. Adrian's strategy room contained an enormous map displaying cargo routes across the East Coast. Colored pins marked warehouses, ports, and trucking depots. While officers discussed security, Maeve quietly examined the routes. Again, Patterns emerged. Certain trucks consistently changed routes for reasons that made little logistical sense. A shipment, traveling 50 miles, sometimes detoured nearly 90. Fuel costs increased. Delivery times slowed. Nobody questioned it, because each detour appeared individually reasonable. Together, they formed something else. A hidden network. She borrowed a notepad. No one stopped her. She drew several lines connecting ports from Boston to Providence, then New York. The shape surprised even her. The unnecessary detours always intersected near facilities controlled by shell companies that technically belonged to nobody, yet somehow handled freight from all three syndicates. Impossible. Unless the same invisible hand had infiltrated every organization simultaneously. Knox found her surrounded by maps. "What are you doing?" She looked up. "Trying to understand your supply routes." He laughed. "Our captains barely understand them." She smiled faintly. "That's the problem." He walked closer. Studied the paper. Saw only lines. "What exactly am I looking at?" "I think." She paused. "Someone has been stealing from all three of you." Knox burst into loud laughter. "You think 3 Mafia empires are being robbed, and nobody noticed?" "I think everyone noticed losses. They simply believed they belonged to separate problems." His laughter slowly faded. That evening, the 3 bosses happened to meet for another discussion regarding her debt. Before negotiations began, Maeve interrupted. "I need 5 minutes." 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. One impatient. One curious. One unreadable. Luca spoke first. This had better matter. She placed her handwritten notes on the table. "I believe all 3 of your organizations have the same enemy." Silence. She continued anyway. "The thefts aren't independent. The shipping delays aren't accidental. The accounting losses aren't bookkeeping errors. They're connected." Knox leaned back. "So according to you, someone has been stealing from every syndicate simultaneously?" "Yes." Adrian finally asked the only question that mattered. "What evidence do you have?" She slid forward several pages. "No proof. Not yet. Only patterns." Luca reviewed the calculations without expression. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The room remained completely silent. Finally, he reached for his laptop. No explanation. No conversation. He simply began verifying the figures one by one. Warehouse records. Fuel invoices. Shipping manifests. Insurance claims. Insurance claims. Transaction histories. His typing gradually slowed, then stopped. He opened another database. Compared another month's reports, then another. Color drained from his face. Adrian noticed first. "What did you find?" Luca answered without looking up. "She's right." Nobody moved. He continued. "The discrepancies extend back almost 4 years. Every company believed it was losing money independently." He looked directly at Maeve. "But when the data is combined, someone has siphoned millions." Knox stared at her as though seeing a completely different woman. The frightened flower seller who had arrived carrying nothing but debt had just uncovered a conspiracy hidden beneath thousands of financial records that veteran accountants, experienced capos, and 3 Mafia empires had failed to detect. For the first time since Patrick Donovan disappeared, none of the 3 Mafia bosses looked at Maeve Donovan as collateral. They looked at her as something infinitely more valuable, a mind capable of changing the balance of power itself. No one celebrated the discovery. In the Mafia world, finding a problem only created another. The missing millions had not vanished by accident. Someone intelligent, patient, and deeply connected had been bleeding 3 criminal empires at the same time, without leaving enough evidence to expose himself. The obvious question remained. What now? The following morning, Adrian summoned Maeve to the conference room. Unlike before, She was no longer asked to wait outside. A chair had been placed at the end of the table. Small, ordinary, yet everyone in the room noticed it. For the first time, the flower seller had been invited to participate instead of merely observe. Adrian folded his hands. "You found the pattern. Can you find the people responsible?" Maeve answered honestly. "I don't know." The room grew quiet. Then she added, "But I know where they will make their next mistake." Luca looked up. "Explain." She walked toward the large logistics map covering one wall. If someone successfully stole from one company, they would stop. If someone stole from 3 rival organizations simultaneously, they became addicted to believing nobody could connect the evidence. She circled several warehouses. Confidence creates repetition, and repetition creates patterns. For nearly an hour, she explained everything she had observed. Duplicate transportation invoices, artificial maintenance costs, warehouses operating below capacity while reporting maximum expenses, shipping routes that looked efficient on paper but wasted hundreds of unnecessary miles every week. None of the individual mistakes appeared significant. Together, they represented a system deliberately designed to leak money. Veteran capos exchanged uncertain glances. Several disliked listening to a civilian. One finally interrupted. "With respect, you've never run a warehouse. You've never managed soldiers. You've never handled international cargo. What makes you think you understand our business?" Maeve didn't react. Instead, she smiled politely. "You're right. I don't understand your business. I understand systems." She pointed toward another chart. "And systems behave the same whether they're banks, shipping companies, or flower markets." The room fell silent again. Knox suddenly laughed. Not mockingly. Genuinely. "I like her." The capos looked confused. Knox shrugged. "She doesn't pretend to know everything. Only the part she actually understands." Adrian noticed something important. The discussion had changed. For the first time, no one questioned whether Maeve possessed intelligence. Now they questioned only how much. That difference mattered. Several days later, Maeve requested another meeting. This time she arrived carrying a thick notebook. Inside were pages filled with handwritten calculations, warehouse diagrams, flowcharts, scheduling models, color-coded transportation routes. Luca flipped through the notebook slowly. Every page contained detailed observations. No decoration, no unnecessary words, only solutions. He finally looked at her. "When exactly did you prepare all of this?" "At night, when everyone else was sleeping." Knox frowned. "You've barely slept." She shrugged gently. "I've spent years working 2 jobs. I'm used to it." Something about that answer lingered in the room, not because it sounded impressive, because nobody doubted it was true. Maeve took a slow breath. "I have a proposal." Every eye focused on her. "My father's debt belongs to him. But I know none of you will simply erase it." No one argued. She continued. "So let me earn it." Luca remained expressionless. "What exactly are you offering?" "I'll audit every warehouse. I'll examine every shipping schedule. I'll review every financial report. I'll identify waste, corruption, and theft." She paused. "For every verified recovery. Reduce the debt." The room remained completely still. One elderly capo shook his head. "Impossible. $1 million isn't erased with paperwork." Maeve met his eyes calmly. "No, but millions can be recovered through efficiency." Adrian studied her for a long moment. "You understand what you're proposing?" She nodded. "If I fail, I'm still collateral. If I succeed, you recover money that was already yours." Knox leaned toward Adrian. "She's gambling." Maeve answered before Adrian could. "No, my father gambled. I'm calculating." The distinction made even Knox smile. After hours of debate, the three bosses reached an agreement. Every verified financial recovery would reduce Patrick Donovan's debt. The exact percentage would depend on the amount recovered. Nothing would be forgiven. Everything had to be earned. Maeve accepted immediately. She never asked for easier terms. The work began the next morning. She visited warehouses most executives ignored. Instead of interviewing managers first, she spoke with forklift operators, truck mechanics, security guards, night shift cleaners, people invisible to senior leadership. She asked simple questions. Which loading dock is always delayed? Which trucks constantly return late? What equipment breaks most often? What paperwork do people complain about? No one had ever asked them before. Workers talked, not because they trusted the Mafia, because someone had finally listened. Patterns emerged astonishingly fast. One warehouse repeatedly ordered replacement machinery that never actually failed. Another reported fuel consumption impossible for the recorded mileage. Several supervisors approved invoices from companies sharing the same mailing address under different names. When Maeve presented the evidence, investigations followed. Within 2 weeks, 3 corrupt managers disappeared. No one asked where. Within 1 month, 7 shell companies vanished from the payment system. Millions quietly returned. Luca personally reviewed every discovery. Each time he expected to find an error. Each time the numbers confirmed her conclusions. Eventually, he stopped checking whether she was correct. He began asking how she found answers so quickly. She smiled. I don't look for theft. I look for things that don't belong. Adrian assigned analysts to work beside her. Experienced professionals with decades of organizational knowledge. At first, they believed they were supervising her. Within days, they found themselves taking notes. She never humiliated anyone, never claimed superiority. If someone offered a better solution, she adopted it immediately. People stopped competing with her. They started collaborating. Knox experienced the greatest surprise. His warehouses traditionally relied on intimidation. Mistakes were corrected through fear. Maeve changed that without asking permission. One afternoon, Knox arrived, expecting another disciplinary meeting. Instead, he found mechanics, drivers, and warehouse workers gathered around a whiteboard. Maeve was explaining a new loading sequence. Boxes moved less. Workers walked shorter distances. Loading time dropped almost 30% during the first trial. No shouting, no threats, just organization. Knox watched silently. One of his captains approached. We've never finished early before, Knox answered quietly. I noticed. Word spread across the alliance. Not about the flour seller, about the woman solving problems nobody else could solve. Capos, who once dismissed her, began requesting her opinion before approving expensive projects. Managers voluntarily brought reports to her office. Drivers pointed out suspicious deliveries because they believed she would actually investigate. Respect had appeared gradually, almost invisibly, until one day everyone realized it had already become normal. Late one evening, Adrian found Maeve alone, reviewing inventory reports. The building had nearly emptied. He placed a cup of coffee beside her. You forgot dinner. She looked surprised. I lost track of time. He glanced toward the towering stacks of paperwork. You've reduced nearly $300,000 from the debt. She nodded. There is still more. There always is. Adrian observed her quietly. Most people pursued power. Others pursued wealth. Maeve pursued improvement. Every solved problem simply led her toward the next one. For the first time in many years, Adrian realized he had invested in someone who expected nothing except the opportunity to prove her worth. Across the city, whispers began circulating through Boston's criminal underworld. Not about Adrian, not about Luca, not about Knox. They spoke instead about a woman who could read an accounting ledger like other people read a confession. Some called her an accountant. Others called her a strategist. A few whispered something far more dangerous. If the three Mafia bosses truly trusted the same woman, then whoever had stolen from them for years had just gained the most formidable opponent he would ever face. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from gunfire. It came from silence. Warehouse 14 was never quiet. Located near Boston Harbor, it operated around the clock. Forklifts moved endlessly. Cargo containers arrived every hour. Radios crackled without interruption. On that particular evening, everything stopped. Maeve noticed it before anyone else. She had been reviewing delivery schedules inside the operations office when she looked at the live logistics dashboard. 3 trucks had failed to report their arrivals. Not 1, 3. Their GPS signals had disappeared simultaneously. Machines malfunctioned. Drivers made mistakes. But 3 independent failures occurring within the same minute. That wasn't coincidence. She immediately picked up the radio. Has anyone spoken with convoys 12, 15, and 19? Static. Then a hesitant reply. No contact for 7 minutes. Her heartbeat quickened. 7 minutes was an eternity in the transportation business. Knox happened to be inspecting the warehouse with 24 soldiers. He noticed Maeve, walking toward him faster than usual. What is it? I think this place is about to be attacked. The nearby guards exchanged confused looks. You know that because... She handed Knox the tablet displaying the shipping routes. The missing trucks aren't late. They're blocking the access roads. Knox stared at the screen, then at the entrance. His instincts screamed that she was right. He didn't ask another question. Everyone. Defensive positions. The order had barely left his mouth when the first explosion shattered the front gate. Steel twisted. Glass burst inward. Automatic gunfire erupted from both sides of the loading yard. Workers scattered in panic. Several armed men disguised as freight drivers emerged from the disabled trucks. This was never a robbery. It was an execution. Someone intended to eliminate Knox and destroy the evidence hidden inside Warehouse 14. Knox instantly became what the underworld feared most. A force of nature. He pushed workers behind concrete barriers before charging toward the attackers. Every movement was direct, brutal, efficient. Within seconds, several gunmen lay unconscious. Others fled behind shipping containers, but the ambush had been carefully planned. Another explosion echoed through the warehouse. One of the massive steel support beams snapped. The roof groaned, then began collapsing. "Move!" Knox shouted. His soldiers rushed toward the exits. Most escaped. Knox did not. A falling section of steel crashed directly onto him as he shoved 2 younger guards out of its path. The impact threw him to the ground. Dust filled the air. Concrete cracked beneath the enormous weight pressing across his legs and shoulder. For the first time anyone could remember, Knox Callahan could not stand. Gunfire still echoed outside. The surviving attackers continued advancing. One captain grabbed Maeve's arm. "We have to leave." She looked toward the collapsed structure. Knox had disappeared beneath twisted steel. The captain pulled harder. "He'll die if we stay." Maeve answered quietly. "He'll die if we leave." She pulled free, then ran back into the collapsing warehouse. The heat was suffocating. Sprinklers burst overhead. Smoke mixed with dust until breathing became painful. She searched desperately through the wreckage. Finally, she heard his voice. "Over here!" Knox was conscious. Barely. A steel girder pinned his shoulder, while another trapped both legs. Blood covered one side of his face. When he saw Maeve, he frowned. "What are you doing?" Leaving was the smart choice. She ignored the question. Instead, she examined the wreckage. Years of solving logistical problems had taught her something unexpected. Heavy objects rarely required overwhelming strength, only the correct leverage. She spotted a damaged forklift nearby. Its engine still worked. Several frightened workers had remained hidden inside the warehouse. Maeve called to them. "I need your help." One shook his head. "The roof is coming down. I know. If we don't move now, he dies." There was something about the certainty in her voice that erased hesitation. 4 workers followed her. Together they attached heavy chains between the forklift and the fallen beam. The first attempt failed. The chain snapped. Another minute disappeared. Dust continued falling from the ceiling. Knox looked at her. "Enough. Take everyone and go." She met his eyes. "No. You've spent your entire life carrying everyone else. Today, someone carries you." For a brief second, the hardest man in Boston had no answer. The second attempt succeeded. The forklift strained violently. Metal screamed. The beam lifted only a few inches. It was enough. The workers dragged Knox free. Almost immediately, another section of the roof collapsed exactly where he had been trapped. Had they waited another 10 seconds, there would have been nothing left to rescue. Outside, reinforcements from Adrian and Luca arrived moments later. The attackers retreated before being surrounded. Several were captured alive. Others disappeared into the night. Emergency crews secured the burning warehouse. Only then did Knox finally sit up against a concrete barrier. He watched Maeve helping injured workers before allowing medics to examine her own bleeding hands. She had dozens of cuts, bruised ribs, burned palms. Yet the first question she asked was, "Did everyone make it out?" Not, "Am I all right?" Knox lowered his eyes. No one had ever chosen his life over their own safety. Not once. Until now. The story spread through every organization before sunrise. Some claimed she had run into gunfire. Others insisted she had personally lifted steel beams. The details changed with each retelling. Only one fact remained constant. Maeve Donovan had risked everything to save Knox Callahan. Without hesitation, without negotiation, without expecting anything in return. A few days later, Knox entered the operations office, carrying a small wooden box. He placed it on Maeve's desk. Inside rested a single silver rose, handcrafted, beautiful. "What is this?" Knox scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "My mother used to collect silver roses. They meant—" He searched unsuccessfully for the right words. That someone belonged with the family. Maeve looked at him quietly. "I don't know what to say. You don't have to." He nodded once, then left. It was the longest speech anyone had ever heard Knox voluntarily give. Adrian changed as well. He no longer invited Maeve merely to observe strategic meetings. He asked her opinion first, sometimes before his own advisors. At first, the executives found this unsettling. Eventually, they accepted reality. When Maeve spoke, Adrian listened. Luca changed in quieter ways. Late one evening, he found Maeve correcting shipment forecasts. "You've recalculated everything." She nodded. There were hidden delays. He studied her work. Every projection proved more accurate than his original models, for perhaps the first time in his professional life. He had met someone whose mind challenged his own. Instead of threatening him, he found it strangely comforting. Weeks passed, then months. The debt continued shrinking. Recovered assets reached into the millions. The alliance between the 3 syndicates grew stronger than anyone believed possible. But somewhere beyond Boston, the unseen architect behind the financial conspiracy watched every development carefully. His invisible network had survived for years because powerful men distrusted one another. Now, a former flower seller had united them. She wasn't simply recovering stolen money anymore. She was destroying the very conditions that had allowed his empire to exist. And that made Maeve Donovan the most dangerous woman in the country. The mastermind finally made his decision. If he could not corrupt her, he would force her to make an impossible choice. He ordered his men to find the one person whose existence still had the power to break her heart. Patrick Donovan, the father who had sold his own daughter. The final move of the game had just begun. For nearly 4 years, the mastermind had remained invisible. He never signed documents, never attended meetings, never issued direct threats. Instead, he manipulated desperate people, bought corrupt managers, and quietly redirected millions through companies that officially existed only on paper. No witness could identify him. No financial trail ever reached his name, until he made one fatal mistake. He underestimated Maeve Donovan. 3 days after Patrick Donovan disappeared, a plain envelope arrived at the Alliance headquarters. Inside was a single photograph. Patrick sat tied to a chair inside an abandoned warehouse, bruised, terrified. Beneath the picture was a handwritten message: "Bring Maeve Donovan alone, or your father dies." No signature, no demands for money, only a location. Knox crushed the paper in his fist. "It's a trap." Luca nodded. "Obviously." Adrian remained unusually quiet. Every pair of eyes turned toward Maeve. She looked at the photograph for several seconds, then calmly placed it back on the table. "He wants us to react emotionally." No one interrupted. "He believes my father is my weakness." She looked toward the map covering the wall. "That assumption is the only weakness he has left." Instead of preparing a rescue mission, Maeve requested every financial record recovered over the previous months. Warehouse schedules, radio logs, shipping manifests, telephone records, fuel purchases, even cafeteria deliveries. The senior capos exchanged confused glances. Knox finally asked, "How does food help us find kidnappers?" Maeve smiled slightly. "Because criminals lie. Habits don't." She spread dozens of documents across the conference table. For years, this man built his operation on efficiency. He avoids unnecessary movement. He reuses people. He repeats successful systems. Her finger stopped above several transportation reports. "The kidnappers chose this warehouse because they expected us to attack immediately. So, they already prepared an escape route." She traced a line across the harbor. "But the obvious escape isn't the real one." Luca's eyes narrowed. "You found another pattern." She nodded. "They'll leave through the shipping terminal. Everyone stopped monitoring after we reorganized the routes." Adrian studied the documents, then slowly smiled. The expression surprised everyone. It appeared only when he encountered a strategy elegant enough to admire. Within the hour, the Alliance mobilized. Not as 3 competing syndicates, as one organization. Knox secretly positioned his soldiers around the abandoned warehouse. Adrian quietly secured every road leading away from the district. Luca froze financial transfers connected to every shell company Maeve had previously identified. Instead of attacking immediately, they waited, exactly as Maeve instructed. Night settled over the harbor. The kidnappers expected panic. Instead, nothing happened. Inside the warehouse, Patrick grew increasingly confused. "So, they're not coming?" One masked guard laughed. "I guess your daughter finally realized you're not worth dying for." Patrick lowered his head. For the first time in years, silence forced him to confront every decision that had led him there. Every lie, every borrowed dollar, every promise broken, every moment his daughter had carried burdens he should have carried himself. Outside the warehouse, Maeve watched through binoculars. Knox stood beside her. "If we wait much longer, they'll move him," she answered quietly. "I know. They have to. That's when we win." Exactly 23 minutes later, The warehouse doors opened. 3 cargo vans emerged. Not one. 3. Each drove toward a different exit. Knox reached for his radio. Which one? Maeve never hesitated. The middle. Knox frowned. Why? Because it's the only vehicle leaving half empty. The others are decoys. Without another question, he gave the order. Everything happened at once. Roadblocks appeared. Hidden vehicles blocked every escape route. Adrian's teams sealed the harbor. Luca remotely disabled fuel payments and electronic gate access across the port district. The convoy found itself trapped inside a shrinking circle. Gunfire erupted briefly, then stopped, not because the kidnappers surrendered, because every possible escape had already disappeared. Exactly as Maeve predicted, the mastermind attempted to flee on foot through an abandoned freight terminal. He almost succeeded, until he reached Platform 9. There, waiting calmly beside the railway tracks, stood Maeve. She wasn't armed. She wasn't surrounded by soldiers. She simply stood with quiet confidence. The man laughed. "So you're the famous flower seller?" "I expected someone older," she answered softly. "I expected someone smarter." His smile faded. "You think you've won?" She shook her head. "No. I think you lost months ago. You just hadn't noticed yet." Behind him, Knox's soldiers emerged from the shadows. Ahead, Adrian's men blocked the tracks. Above, Luca's drones illuminated the entire terminal. For the first time in years, the invisible man had nowhere left to disappear. Patrick was brought safely outside. He looked older than Maeve remembered. Smaller, broken. The confident gambler had vanished. Only a frightened father remained. He slowly approached her. Tears filled his eyes. "I'm sorry. I never meant." She gently raised one hand, stopping him. "No. You meant every decision. You simply never imagined living with the consequences." Patrick collapsed onto his knees. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." Maeve looked at the man she had once sacrificed everything to protect. She remembered unpaid bills, cold apartments, missed birthdays, abandoned dreams. Long nights, selling roses while he chased impossible luck. Finally, she spoke. "The daughter you sold no longer exists." Patrick's shoulders trembled. "You lost her. The day you chose money over family." There was no anger in her voice, only acceptance. She turned around and walked away, without looking back. This time, Patrick understood. Some debts could never be repaid. Months passed. The investigation dismantled the remaining theft network. Corrupt managers disappeared. Fraudulent companies collapsed. The alliance recovered tens of millions of dollars, but the greatest change could not be measured in money. It could only be measured in trust. The headquarters no longer contained 3 separate operations centers. They became one. At its heart stood a glass-walled office overlooking the harbor. The name beside the door read, Maeve Donovan, Director of Operations. No mention of debt. No mention of collateral. Only the position she had earned. Every shipping route connecting the 3 syndicates passed through her office. Every logistics decision required her approval. Veteran capos who once mocked her now stood respectfully whenever she entered the room, not because anyone ordered them to. Because respect cannot be demanded, only earned. Business leaders from across the East Coast soon noticed something unusual. Meetings with Adrian Volkov, Luca Marino, or Knox Callahan almost always began the same way. One of the 3 would ask, "What does Maeve recommend?" Her judgment became the standard against which every proposal was measured. Not because she possessed the most authority, but because she had repeatedly proven she possessed the clearest mind. One quiet evening, The four of them stood on the balcony, overlooking Boston Harbor. Ships moved steadily beneath the city lights. Each vessel represented another successful operation. Another reminder of how far everything had changed. Knox broke the silence first. "You know, I almost left you under that warehouse." Maeve laughed softly. "I'm aware." Luca folded his arms. "The return on investment has exceeded every forecast." Adrian looked toward the skyline. For once, even he allowed himself a faint smile. The greatest investment we ever made was refusing to let a frightened flower seller walk away. None of the others argued, because for the first time since they had met, all three Mafia bosses agreed completely. Long after the debts had been erased, long after Patrick Donovan had faded into memory, people still told stories about the woman who once sold roses beneath the streetlights of Boston. Some remembered her courage, others remembered her brilliance. But those who truly knew the story remembered something even greater. Power had never changed Maeve Donovan. It had simply revealed who she had always been. A woman whose greatest weapon was not fear, not wealth, not violence, but the quiet certainty that dignity, intelligence, and compassion could accomplish what armies never could. And that was why, when she finally took her place at the head of the negotiation table, no one questioned whether she belonged there. Because she had never been given power. She had earned the respect of the most dangerous men in the country. One decision, one sacrifice, and one impossible calculation at a time.